Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Atlantic Council's headquarters here in Washington, D.C. A warm welcome also to our audiences joining us virtually from Turkey, across Eurasia, and around the world. My name is Defne Arslan. I'm the Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Turkey program. Before we get started, I would like to thank the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center, led by Ambassador John Herbst, for co-hosting with us today. This conversation comes at a pivotal moment. In the last year, we have watched the Trump administration truly capitalize on the increasing momentum we are seeing across Central Asia. There is growing recognition around the world of the crucial role Central Asia can play in the global economy, security, and supply chains. Turkey has long been one of the most influential players in the region. I have followed Turkey's growing relations with Central Asian countries, from defense to energy, from hospitality to textiles, since the 90s in my previous capacities. With the United States increasingly turning to engage with the region, we believe it is important to consider the roles of United States allies like Turkey are playing. Finding areas of alignment, examining points of friction will be key to shaping a holistic and smart United States Central Asia strategy. We have an excellent lineup of speakers to discuss this important topic. At this point, I would like to introduce Kiran Bayes, our research assistant here at the Atlantic Council's Turkey program and the moderator of today's event. Kiran has traveled across the region and has been thinking deeply about these issues, having recently written an in-depth report that explores the topic we are discussing. Now I will turn the floor over to Kiran to kick off the panel and introduce our panelists. And I'd like to welcome you all again here in the audience. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you again to the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. They've been really lovely partners in helping us to create this event. My name is Kiran Bayes. I'm a research assistant here at the Atlantic Council's Turkey programs, and I primarily focus on energy and security issues in the Black and Caspian Seas. Defne already gave us a good intro. Turkey undoubtedly has built over the last 3 decades a formidable presence across Central Asia, not only building on their linguistic and their cultural ties, as we often talk about, but more importantly, by also just, showing up. Central Asia has been in the news a lot over the last few days, last few weeks, last year. It's a hot topic, and this is pretty obvious. As we can see, we have some really excellent turnout. There are a couple of small notes I'd like to sort of offer, perhaps posit before we get started here. The first one is, I think it's important to note that Central Asia's value to the US, to the West, to the world, it extends far beyond simply its immense mineral and energy wealth. When we look at the region right now, there are incredible transformations that are happening in a variety of levels, whether those are through rapidly expanding and developing economies, a very healthy startup and tech culture, reindustrialization, and or even acting as a hub for global goods. Of course, Brian is inevitably going to talk about security and the role that Central Asia has played in the security partnerships that exist between the US and Central Asian countries for several decades. The other thing I want to note is, as this is an event not only examining Turkish policy in Central Asia, but the interplay between Turkish and American policy in Central Asia, I think at the moment there's not enough appreciation for the work that is happening in the US, or in the US in Central Asia. And this is not just in reference to the incredible high-level meetings and successes that we've seen in the last few days and last few weeks, but over the last few years where the US has engaged throughout the region. I was in Tashkent last year, for example, and I was really shocked to learn that in the span of just 5 years, the US managed to train 18,000 English teachers in Uzbekistan alone. So I mean, these are really incredible achievements. And yet, the old truism in Washington is that the US does not care and that the US does not do enough in Central Asia. And well, truisms exist for a reason, and there are still enormous challenges that exist. And this is not just in reference to political will, but this is also in reference to sort of basic things that one has to deal with, whether that is geographical distance, cultural and linguistic differences, different legal systems, or an overall high cost of doing business that is often prohibitive and often exacerbated by other political sensitivities. But this should not be discouraging. Strong business and political ties are possible, and we know this. We know this because many of the allies of the United States, not just Turkey, obviously we're talking about Turkey, but Japan, Korea, have managed to establish very deep presences, very deep relationships across the region. Central Asia is a truly multi-dimensional and also multipolar region. And I think in that spirit, it behooves us to learn from our friends who are doing work. And as Daphne put it, find our areas of alignment and friction. And as Daphne already mentioned, you can learn all about my thoughts on this topic in this recent report, that there might be some links hanging around on the chairs or something like that. But I also think I would be remiss if I didn't also plug a recent report that was written by one of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council, Kyoku Imai, who recently wrote about Japan's presence in Central Asia and the areas for opportunity and cooperation that exist there. But you all are not here to hear from me. You all are here to hear from our incredible panel that we have today. So beginning all the way on my left, we have Subir Kurbanov, a consultant for the World Bank. He focuses on Central Asia. Subir brings more than 2 decades of experience, having explored everything from macroeconomic policy to interregional trade to questions of governance. Until not too long ago, he was also the program director for Central Asia at the Center for International Private Enterprise, CIPE. And while he was there, he worked very closely with the State Department in developing the U.S. Central Asia Business Forum, or the B5+1 as it's known today, which has gone on to be extremely successful, very promising. You guys should go find him after this event. In the middle, we have Brianne Todd, Dr. Brianne Todd. Dr. Brianne Todd teaches, well, she's very busy, so she teaches at both the Walsh School of Foreign Service and also at the National Defense University. And she is just coming off a tenure as the Director for Central Asia at the, oh God, what was it, National Security Council? Yeah, okay. So very busy. And then finally, behind us on the screen, joining us from Ankara, is Ambassador Fatih Ceylan, the former Turkish ambassador to NATO, as well as former Turkish ambassador to Sudan. And while he wasn't filling those capacities over his many decades in the MFA, he worked primarily on Eurasia. He once worked as a special representative to Kyrgyzstan, and while he was in Ankara doing policy and bilateral relations, he focused primarily on Eurasia, so much so that he's even been recognized with state awards from Kazakhstan for his work in advancing bilateral relations. So, final thoughts before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. Once again, as you all know, this is a public event that is on the record. I want my friends to not say anything that'll, that maybe they'll regret 10 years from now, but hopefully something maybe they'll regret tomorrow. Secondly, if you'd like to engage with us, you can go ahead and engage with us online, on social media, on X. There are 3 handles you can use, at Atlantic Council, at AC Eurasia, and at AC_TR program. And finally, we will be taking questions from the audience later on. So go ahead and start thinking about that. And that includes the audience, our online audience. You can go ahead and go over to askac.org to submit a question. Please remember to include your full name, your title, and your affiliation. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to turn this right over to Ambassador Ceylan for some very, very brief remarks, 3-4 minutes, just to help sort of catch the audience up and paint a picture of Turkish presence in Central Asia and how that's changed over the last couple of years. And then obviously I've got this whole folder with me with a little bit of tougher questions, and we'll jump and we'll build off of that. Ambassador?
Thank you, Kiran. Let me also thank Atlantic Council, Turkey program, and my co-panelists, and certainly the audience. I'm very pleased that you have brought this topic to the attention of the audience, which I believe will contribute to raising the situational awareness on Central Asia, on the importance of Central Asia for our American colleagues as well. And let me take the liberty of congratulating you on your two recent articles, one dedicated to the same topic and the other on the need for institutionalizing relations between the United States and Central Asia in the wake of C5+1 summit held recently in Washington, D.C. I shall make 7 very brief remarks to set the scene for subsequent consultations on Central Asia, to try to cast some schematic, if you will, light on Turkey's position and presence in Central Asia. First, it must be noted that Turkey was the first country that recognized the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Central Asian states. This is in the annals of history and the collective memory of Central Asian republics. Secondly, please keep in mind 3 buzzwords when we talk about Turkey's presence in Central Asia since their independence. That is recognition of their independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity in the first instance, reintegration of this region to the outside world, free from the influence and pressures of their giant neighbors, that's namely Russia and China, via Turkey. That's the second stage. And finally, the third R is strengthening their resilience, the resilience of their states and societies based on connectivity of the region to alternative actors and sources as a sound safety net. And the examples, the concrete examples of Turkish attitude vis-a-vis Central Asia was the establishment of, for instance, in 1992, that was, I think, June 1992, the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization, which was spearheaded by Turkey. And also, the same year, in November 1992, the Ankara Declaration signed by Turkey and the Central Asian republics and Azerbaijan. That laid the groundwork for Organization of Turkic States, which became a reality in December 2021. The third point, we in Turkey do not distinguish between the South Caucasus and Central Asia. We think they constitute a whole, a great portion of the Eurasian landmass connected to Europe through Turkey. So I think it would be misleading for us here in Turkey to kind of put these regions, the South Caucasus and Central Asia, in different compartments. That's the reason, the main reason why we use the term Trans-Caspian, which is not something abstract for us here in Turkey. It's a whole strategic area and an asset that cannot be neglected. The fourth point, I have observed, and I believe that Turkey has been playing a vital role as a bridge and a gateway for both the South Caucasus and Central Asia in integrating them with the European and Euro-Atlantic institutions. And this role has now become much more important given the present global challenges and the prevalent geostrategic rivalry among the major powers. The fifth point, the cooperation between the United States and Turkey back in the late 1990s produced concrete results, such as the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan oil pipeline, which also carries Kazakh oil to Ceyhan seaport in the Mediterranean, the Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum natural gas pipeline, and finally, the Trans-Anatolian pipeline that carries Azerbaijani natural gas to Europe through Trans-Adriatic pipeline to Austria and to Italy. The sixth point is that the connectivity has become very important. And we were the front runners in launching a very giant connectivity project back in 2010, which is now defined as the Middle Corridor, and which I can elaborate in detail during the rest of this program. And I believe that connectivity, in its widest meaning, has become a direct object of geopolitical and geostrategic competition involving the United States, Russia, and China. So it's become a vital topic, including different lines of communication, not only confined to transport and logistics, but also energy and what have you. Last point, the concluding point, I do believe that, like in the past, there exists ample opportunities for cooperation between Turkey, Europe, and the United States, focused on Central Asia and the South Caucasus. This is something that we should capitalize on, and I believe it would be extremely useful to increase the contacts between Turkish business community and their American and European counterparts, so that this region will be strongly tied to Turkey, to Europe, and to the West at large. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Ambassador. All right, let's jump into it, shall we? All right, we're going to begin with defense right here. So over the last decade, certainly over the last decade, but over the last few decades, Turkey has developed very notable defense ties to Central Asian states, whether this is through joint exercises, arms sales, or in even some cases, the establishment of joint ventures for joint production. We're seeing this particularly in Kazakhstan, where, for example, the Turkish companies YDA and Asfat have collaborated to expand and build shipyards in Uralsk and in Kuryk. There's Anka drone production, co-production in Kazakhstan, and even KAE, which is a joint venture between Kazakhstan and the Turkish defense company Aselsan, has operated for now 14 going on 15 years, where they produce avionics for helicopters, they produce armored vehicles, optics, and so on. So needless to say, the security presence and the defense presence that Turkey has built in the region is increasingly deep. And so I'm going to turn to Brienne first. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the U.S. is viewing these developments?
Great question. First of all, I'm going to say, as you pointed out at the beginning, I have many affiliations right now. So today, I will make the obligatory disclaimer that I'm giving my own viewpoints, not representing any particular institution. Insofar as Turkey is engaging with the different countries in Central Asia, I think we're very encouraging of this, because clearly there's a lot of capacity that Turkey brings to Central Asia in terms of development, technical assistance. They have the ties, they've had the ties for many years. I think there's a natural affinity there in many ways. It seems like there's a lot that can happen. And clearly Turkish companies are reaching out to each of these countries, and a lot of work is happening there. I think we are generally encouraging of that. The one caveat I would make to that is, ultimately though, companies are in for market share, and they're there to make profit. And certainly, I think, as the US looks at what Turkey is doing in Central Asia, we would certainly want US companies out there as well. So insofar as we would have any issue with that, I think the issue would be, yes, there's a lot of Turkish companies working with companies in Central Asia. What role could there be for US companies in that as well?
I think that's a great question. And the obvious follow-up is maybe can you tell us a little bit more about the degree of coordination or integration that exists between Turkish defense work in the region and either NATO as a broader institution or other NATO allies?
So I think NATO is tricky when you talk about Central Asia because, first of all, you have to recognize that many of the countries in the region are members of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So I think when you say NATO, there's immediately that concern of, well, how would that work with CSTO obligations?
You're beating me to my next question.
Yes, I always like to preempt. But I do think that we have to acknowledge the fact that they do work with NATO countries in a number of capacities. They're all working as part of the Partnership for Peace Consortium. The countries all have IPAPs, Individual Partnership Action Plans. So there is some work being done with NATO in terms of working with Turkey under the umbrella of NATO. I don't think that's necessarily the top priority. I think a lot of the cooperation that we see occurring, whether it is with Turkey or even with the United States, it's not through or by NATO. It is much more on a bilateral basis.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, do you have anything to add?
You mentioned about Kazakhstan rightly. There has been a visible increase in defense industry cooperation between Turkey and Kazakhstan. But you didn't mention about Turkmenistan. I mean, we built fast patrol boats for Turkmenistan and trying to expand the capacity of the seaports at the Caspian Sea, Turkmenbashi and Aktau in Kazakhstan and Kurik as well, so that these naval assets could benefit from these. One important point is that, of course, when we talk about our relations with Central Asia, the important concept of maintaining and strengthening supply chains is very much in fashion, rightly so. But let's not forget about the projection of value chains. For instance, when we talk about defense industry cooperation, what we produce here in Turkey are totally in conformity with NATO standards. It's a production that has to comply with NATO standards. And when you cooperate in such technologies, be it in the civil sector or the private sector or the military sector, what have you, you are also injecting to those countries value chains. And among these value chains, for instance, when we talk about the defense industry cooperation, we are talking about NATO standards. So this is, in a way, an indirect conduit for making these republics getting acquainted more and more with the Western technology via joint ventures with Turkey. And this is an important point that we have to keep in our minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So you mentioned Kazakhstan and you also mentioned Turkmenistan.
Right.
There are still 3 other Central Asian countries that we haven't talked about, and there are defense ties to those countries, but certainly not to the same level. Could you perhaps describe to us briefly what the next step would be, conceivably, for Turkish defense work in the region?
Well, I did not mention Kyrgyzstan, for instance. I would say in the recent decade or so, there have been tremendous steps taken by both sides in increasing their cooperation. And that's not only confined to economic and commercial ties, but also military relations. So I think also with the impetus provided by the Organization of Turkish States, despite the fact that defense is not included in the big manifesto announced in December 2021, that when the Organization of Turkish States was established, this area has been expanding between Turkey and Central Asian republics. And as I already underlined before, I mean, we do not make any distinction among those countries, be it, the South Caucasus, including Georgia, Azerbaijan, and I hope also Armenia in the future, maybe in the very near future, and Central Asian states, including Tajikistan, which is not part of the Turkic republics, but the ties between Turkey and Tajikistan have been very well. We did not distinguish whatsoever Tajikistan when we talked about Central Asia, and I have to underline this. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, you mentioned OTS, and this is the inevitable sort of next step in talking about defense because, well, OTS is not an alliance, it is not a military alliance, and it cannot be, particularly because, well, many of the OTS members are also members of the CSTO. And yet, even still, at the most recent OTS summit in Azerbaijan, in Gabala, we saw that the Azerbaijani president, Aliyev, mentioned the possibility of there being joint Turkic military exercises. And there have been bilateral and multilateral exercises happening within individual states of or members of the Organization of Turkic States. But this is the first time, to my knowledge, that we've heard something like this be talked about at an OTS forum or potentially under the OTS umbrella. So let's perhaps begin with Brianne, and then we'll go back to the ambassador. How can you navigate this sort of balance between an increasing direction towards security and interest in security with OTS and CSTO commitments? And generally speaking, how can Turkey more broadly navigate the increasingly complicated sort of political landscape that is inevitable to defense relationships?
So I don't think that these things are mutually exclusive. Like, I don't think that these countries have to choose between doing military or defense activities with CSTO or, say, OTS. And I think when you get all these countries together in, say, an OTS setting, security is naturally going to come up as one of the issues for discussion, because that's one of the common elements that they all have to discuss, being in the same neighborhood and facing many of the same challenges. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, and I think that Turkey is perfectly positioned to kind of take the lead on security discussions in terms of what more can we be doing, say perhaps in terms of training and education. I don't think that that means then that any country that wants to work with Turkey in the military defense sphere then has to be concerned about what does that mean insofar as their CSTO obligations. Like, I think they can manage to balance all of these things.
Any brief comments, Ambassador?
Well, we are talking about the CSTO obligations. That's correct, but let's not forget the implications of the aggressive attitude of Russia that still continues against Ukraine. I mean, that did have implications for the attitude of Central Asian states. I mean, remember, for instance, Armenia. In that, I mean, it just froze its CSTO membership, and there is a surge, as far as I can see, in Central Asian republics to further implement what, for instance, Kazakhstan calls multi-vector diplomacy. Mongolia calls it third neighbor policy. And I think there is an area, a potential area of cooperation between, Turkey, Central Asia, including Europe and the United States, when it comes to expanding ties, certainly including the security domain. And for this reason, I think this would be a good subject to address between Turkey, Central Asia, and our Western allies and partners. And under present circumstances, I think we should not remain shy and sit on our laurels to watch the events unfolding. We should be more active and proactive in building further ties, including the security domain. Security was included in that declaration that established the Organization of Turkic States, but for different sensitivities regarding the vestiges, I would say, of Russian influence still prevailing in Central Asia and also in the South Caucasus. It's not an easy field to proceed, but nevertheless, we should persevere in our efforts to try to bring those countries and get them more and more acquainted with how Turkey, for instance, Turkey's military and defense production operates. This has been achieved in Azerbaijan, for instance. And it's no surprise that Aliyev made such a call in Gabala at the recent OTC summit there. And this could trickle down to other Central Asian states. I mean, there's already an in-place cooperation between Turkey and Central Asia in that field. And the scope of it could be expanded with the involvement of our Western allies and partners. That I think there is a room, but that needs further context and consultations between Turkey and its European and American counterparts.
Well, I've got plenty more defense and security questions lined up, but poor Sobi over here has been waiting very patiently. So I think perhaps let's turn to Sobi for a moment and talk a little bit about Turkish business in Central Asia. So when you talk to Americans who want to do business in the region, you often hear a lot of complaining. People talk about the logistical issues, political and legal environments, that there are high risk insurance costs, the list goes on. And yet, as Defne mentioned earlier, there are some 4,000 Turkish businesses that are operating in the region. So can you help us understand a little bit better what is it that is enabling these Turkish businesses to work across Central Asia? And is it something more akin to state support? Is it Turkish business practices? Is it something about the legal system? Or is it something as simple as simply just a matter of will and interest?
Thank you, Kiran, and thank you so much for the invitation to join this event. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be here. And congratulations on the very informative report. I think it's one of the first that looks at Turkey-Central Asia relations from kind of a new angle and in a new era of multipolarism, multivectorism, call it as you wish. I mean, the region is changing very fast. There is new kind of vector of powers emerging. There is also, and be aware that as a Central Asian, I see that how difficult is this neighborhood, that we have China, Russia, and this delicate balancing act is very challenging for Central Asia businesses and leadership. But things are changing, and the Central Asia is trying to adapt. It's a stable, secure region that provides lots of opportunities for economic, trade, and connectivity cooperation. So now to your question, what enables the kind of key lessons learned on Turkish doing business kind of practices in Central Asia? I think importantly to mention that obviously there is no secret Central Asia is not an easy place to do business. And it's not just regulatory or legal regime, it's a kind of accessibility, logistics, connectivity, capacity. It's a far remote region. There was a famous saying that triple or double landlocked region for many countries, including triple landlocked for my Tajikistan, it's hard to access. So logistical costs are very high. And But Turkey, I think, represents an interesting case where the businesses, and especially at small and medium level, succeeded in localizing and developing their presence in Central Asia over last 2 decades, and quite successfully developed their operation. And to summarize key ingredients of their success, as I see them, because I was working with the government, I was working with many international business organizations, and we were launching a series of World Bank doing business reports over these years, and some of them actually showed some progress. In a nutshell, the legal environment have improved significantly, but the actual implementation has lagged behind. But what Turkey did in amazing ways, they managed to kind of to bridge this gap and found a creative ways of regulatory and business compliance and developing and localizing the operation, not through kind of abiding to certain kind of illegal practices, which we can see among other investors. It's easy track to do, where you're an investor, you receive your kind of license and operation, but that's not sustainable, and it's not the most kind of beneficial for both the host country and the foreign investor. But what Turkish businesses did, they found, they localized their production, first of all. They've developed a great awareness of the social norms and business practices existing. They developed own local network of experts, legal experts, and local partners. They've engaged on the basis of trust and, again, localization. They've invested a lot in the workforce training over years, and now they successfully operate in such areas as tourism, hospitality, light manufacturing, textile, you name it. I mean, the trade, connectivity, logistic business operators, and importantly, they bring not only their own investors, they bring best international practices, OECD compliant business practices, especially in the corporate governance. And a lot of Turkish businesses operating in Central Asia, they're also franchises of US, American, and European brands. And because why they succeeding? Because I think, in my understanding, that the Turkey itself came this path after the World War II, when they've attracted a lot of investments for the Turkey economic industrial modernization from Japan, Korea, from United States, and they managed to localize these investors. They managed to learn and then adopt these practices to the local regime. And also importantly, mentioned that the Turkey invests a lot in human development education in Central Asia, and that helps significantly to prepare the kind of this best cadre of the civil servants and the business practice officials, practitioners who can work for them and who can support the kind of continuous reintegration. So to summarize, I mean, if you would compare different kind of investment inroad practices from different kind of nations in Central Asia, considering the Central Asia is a high-risk environment still, regulatory business climate is not that kind of easy to navigate. I think you see the China operating on a state-led model. They kind of come to the government, they secure the deals, and then they use the government actually to railroad the involvement and develop the operation, the presence. It's an easy way to do, but I mean, there are questions about the regulatory business compliance. United States and Europe, they obey to the best practices of corporate governance, ESG, especially S&G, and but that is difficult in terms of implementation on the ground. What Turkey is doing, they kind of combining, the blending both personal networks, government networks, business networks, localization, industrial kind of standards, and the local kind of legal regime adaptations to the norms of and possibilities of Turkish businesses to the local environment and engage with the local partners. That's how they succeed. That's how I see it. I think it's a unique way of doing business in Central Asia, which is obviously showing good results both for Central Asia and both for Turkey. especially at the small and medium level. Because you see lots of firms like Chevron, Exxon, China Exim Bank operating on a high level, but you don't see that kind of middle and lower ground, which is the high risks emerge for these businesses. When I was talking to the economic attaché, the US economic attaché in Astana, they were saying a lot. I mean, we see good, like Kazakhstan is a good case. They have amazing US foreign investment portfolio. The high level is easier. On the ground and medium level, there are some issues. But Turkey could be this bridge that connects.
So
both.
let's build upon that a little bit. So you've talked about American business practices in Central Asia. You've talked a little bit about Turkish business practices in Central Asia and different sort of business standards. But can you sort of expand upon the level of compatibility that exists already between Turkish and American companies when it comes to working in the region, whether that's business practices or ESG standards? And then, you mentioned franchising right now, but are there other sort of degrees of cooperation that we're seeing outside of franchising that are worth noting?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. And definitely, this area deserves more kind of deep dive. I think the level of compatibility is quite significant. Turkey is an OECD country, and so they adopted all the kind of main standards of doing business in terms of corporate governance, compliance, business integrity practices, the managerial practices, brand kind of recognition. And these are high bar that's set by international business practices from the US and Europe. And over years, over decades, Turkey localized this kind of brands, and they managed to comply with them over these years. It is very significant, and what helps and I mean, if you look at this, these are not just a set of kind of legal paperwork. You pass on the corporate level on the company, and then you stick with this. Because Central Asia is doing a lot, and Kazakhstan, for example, is being probably a leader in kind of corporate governance, kind of disclosure of shareholder ownership, compliance practices. They've been all passed on paper. There is an international arbitration court in Astana, which serves the whole region and helps foreign investors to kind of have a one-stop shop to resolve their problems with the local legislation. On paper, all these kind of norms and rules were passed and adopted in Central Asia, but there is implementation gaps. What Turkey does, they have developed a kind of a way of engaging with the local legal system through the network and helping navigate these complex issues in the courts, in the government rooms, and in the kind of local legal ecosystem which is not developed. So that is, I think, is quite unique and deserves accomplishment.
Well, as we only have so much time, I'd like to turn to Tajikistan. A very important question. As Ambassador Ceylan mentioned already, Tajikistan is the only country in Central Asia that is not ethnically Turkic, and they're also not part of the Organization of Turkic States. We're seeing across Central Asia that there is increased levels of regional integration, economic integration, political communication between the 5 Central Asian states, whether this is the C5 format or the consultative meetings that we're seeing. And there's a varying level of debate in terms of how important the Turkic element of Turkish engagement with Central Asia is. There are some people that will say that it is everything. There are some people that will say that Turkey is 100% pragmatic in its relationships. But even if we assume that Turkey is 100% pragmatic in its relationships with Central Asia, you still have to contend with the fact that a lot of the way that Turkey engages with the region regionally is through the Organization of Turkic States, and that engagement with Tajikistan, on the surface at least, seems comparatively limited. Whether this is in terms of the volume of aid, the number of high-level diplomatic visits, or even trade volume. I mean, if we compare Kyrgyzstan to Tajikistan, for example, Kyrgyzstan's trade volume with Turkey right now, as of last year, stood at $1.5 billion, which is 3 times the amount with Tajikistan at $445 million, despite the fact that the two countries have roughly similar economic structures, population sizes, and economy sizes. Tajikistan is an important country, whether it is for the region's water, for security, for electricity. They are also growing significantly. So I'd like to turn to Ambassador Ceylan, who had a couple comments already on the strong relationship with Tajikistan. Can you help us understand this a little bit more? And considering that Tajikistan is not in OTS, how do you see Turkey sort of engaging with a regional, broad, all 5 states strategy?
Thank you, Kiran. First of all, let me emphasize that we do not have the luxury of leaving Tajikistan aside when we talk about Central Asia. They have to be within this regional construct, be it infrastructure and otherwise. That's a reality. I believe that, for instance, if Tajikistan applies to Organization of Turkic States, OTS, as an observer, why not? I believe that Turkey would not object to that. There's no reason for Turkish objection to Tajikistan, for instance, applying for an observer status for within the OTS. This is one thing. The second thing is that when we talk about, regional integration and regional economic and commercial ties, Tajikistan is indirectly involved with the Turkic republics. We are talking about Economic Cooperation Organization, for instance. I mean, very similar subjects are also being, addressed within ECO, and Tajikistan is part of Economic Cooperation Organization. But to reinforce its membership in ECO, I think maybe it would be advisable for Tajikistan to attempt to have an observer status, for instance, in OTS. That would be an approach. Second thing I would like to mention, taking my cue from Soviet, which have been very useful, I believe, for the audience, is that we have to focus more and more on the connectivity in its widest meaning. When I talk about connectivity, it's physical, virtual connectivity, from institution to institutional connectivity, and also people-to-people connectivity.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
This is very important. And that would provide ample opportunities for our Western allies and partners in enhancing their ties with this region, certainly including Tajikistan. The idea that we had in our mind when we were developing the Middle Corridor, for instance, was to allow these countries to have access to 3 seas. One is the Caspian Sea, the other is the Black Sea, and the third one is the Mediterranean Sea. Mm-hmm. And under present circumstances, given the geopolitical and geostrategic competition that dominates the global politics, I think the initiative, for instance, the 3 Seas initiative, launched primarily by Central European countries and supported by the EU and the United States, could be combined with the other seas, Caspian and the Mediterranean, making it a 5 Seas initiative. And that could provide, sea access for those landlocked countries. And the importance of connectivity in all 3 dimensions, physical, virtual, institution and people, this is extremely important given the ongoing geopolitical realities. I mean, when we talk about Central Asia and the South Caucasus, we are not talking about only geographical areas or regions. We are talking about geopolitics. And the current situation, as long as Russia continues its war against Ukraine, and we are seeing a visible degree of kind of diminishing influence now in this vast area, there is a window of opportunity to enhance the scope of cooperation and investing more in connecting these countries to the West. The westbound connection, westbound connectivity is important. Of course, it will have to be two-way traffic, not only from Central Asia to Europe and beyond to the United States, but also from the US, Europe, back to Central Asia. And that requires further attention to strengthen the connectivity projects, the critical infrastructure.
Well, you're beating me to
And
my
that
next question
includes
right here.
airports, seaports, energy lines of communication, rare earth minerals. And don't forget, there is also, grain that we all need. For instance, more often than not, Kazakhstan has surplus wheat, and it was not able to export it. So that can also be capitalized, but we need connection for that. Connectivity, increase such opportunities, and nobody mentioned about, but let me mention that for the important project regarding connectivity, for instance, what happened in August 2025, this year in Washington, D.C. I'm talking about the TRIP project, a trilateral joint declaration signed by the United States, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Well, that is another important development in terms of geopolitics in the region, which also extends to Central Asia via the Caspian Sea. This is important. And there we can find opportunities for cooperation as well. For instance, like the United States, Turkey and Azerbaijan and Armenia, with a focus on Central Asia.
Ambassador, I'm very glad that you brought these things up because you're taking me right to my next question. You have spoken a bit, well, first of all, you did talk about observer status in the OTS. So I think it's important that we note in the most recent OTS summit in Gabala that the declaration included a provision for the creation of something called OTS Plus. So a way that it allows, and of course this has not actually been very well developed, so there's a lot more that we need to learn and find out. But ideally this is a streamlined and easier way for other countries to participate in and become member states or observers to the Organization of Turkic States. Now the other thing that you brought up is connectivity, and connectivity is, of course, one of the hot topics of Central Asia. It's incredibly important. And one thing that we haven't mentioned so far is particularly energy connectivity. Energy connectivity is essential for Central Asia. If we look at the largest oil producer in the region, for example, Kazakhstan, some 90% of Kazakhstan's oil moves through Russia, primarily through the CPC pipeline. And this is, we see similar numbers for almost all of the other Central Asian states, which are powerhouses, both in terms of oil, gas. 50% of the world's uranium is coming from Kazakhstan, from Uzbekistan. The list goes on. And this seems to be one area that sort of naturally the US, Turkey, and Central Asian states are very naturally aligned in. As you mentioned earlier, Ambassador, Turkey has a vested interest in making sure that the BTC pipeline, beginning in Baku, Azerbaijan, sees increased flows. So I'm going to turn to Brienne first. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the U.S., and particularly considering that there are American companies, major American companies operating in Central Asian energy, how is the U.S. working, or how can we be working better to increase cross-Caspian energy flows?
So you're absolutely right. There are U.S. companies working in Central Asia. And currently, CPC, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, is the main avenue that everyone is using. I think there's great interest in a trans-Caspian pipeline. But I think for that to happen, we need more assurance about customer base in Europe. I think your report does a great job of outlining why Turkey would be a customer that would have great demand for energy coming out of Central Asia, generating interest in a pipeline. But I think it's always in the details where everyone gets caught up. This is something that has belabored Turkmenistan for many years because we've often looked to the Turkmen to see what their interest is in a Trans-Caspian pipeline. And that is their main concern. You build a pipeline, where is it going to go? Who's going to receive the gas? What kind of price are they going to get for it? So I think that there is potential there, but there's still a lot more work that needs to be done in terms of what that would look like, where the gas would go, who are you going to get to supply it? So I think potential there. But I actually really want to go back to something that the ambassador said.
Please.
So I love the question on energy, but can we go back to OTS for
Please.
a moment?
Yeah.
So yes, I absolutely agree with everything he said about Tajikistan needing to be a member, although I just don't see Tajikistan ever asking for observer status. What I would love to see is Turkey taking a leadership role and inviting Tajikistan to join. But I also really loved what the ambassador said earlier about Armenia as well, because I think from a US perspective, those are the missing pieces in OTS right now. Not having Tajikistan, not having Armenia, for any of these things that we're talking about in terms of connectivity, that's really what you need. And I think the ambassador captured it perfectly when he said, you don't look at these as separate regions, separate countries. You need all of the South Caucasus and all of Central Asia, and you need them working together.
If Tajikistan and Armenia were to become observers of OTS, can you see the U.S. engaging directly with the Organization of Turkic States?
Absolutely. I don't think there would be any reason why we wouldn't under those conditions.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Turkmenistan, and I think maybe we can pivot to that very briefly and then see how that fits into Trans-Caspian energy flows. By the way, as we're reaching sort of the end of this event, I'm going to be taking questions in just a couple minutes, so get ready. So we've seen a number of sort of false starts from Turkmenistan over the last couple of years, where it seems like there's a cycle. Every 3 to 5 years, people get really excited. This is going to be the time that Turkmenistan is ready to, start sending energy elsewhere, to change the border customs, all these different things, and then it never pans out. And I am beginning to get the feeling that this is yet another one of those cycles where we're seeing increasing levels of excitement. For example, recently there was a major customs agreement between Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, where we have this sort of area on the border as well where they can resolve disputes. We're seeing, for the first time, direct flights into Turkmenistan across Central Asia. We know that Azerbaijan is helping Turkmenistan, and Turkey is also helping Turkmenistan develop their gas technologies, particularly with flaring. So in your assessment, could this time be different? And what does that actually mean for Trans-Caspian flows in general, beyond just energy?
When you say this time, I think you're absolutely right to frame it in terms of we've kind of had fits and starts over many decades. But I think at this point in time, there's a lot of really good indicators about Turkmenistan being open to bilateral cooperation with a number of its neighbors. And Azerbaijan is the neighbor that I would pick at this moment to really focus on. I think we saw a lot of great signs over the summer when you had the national leader, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, go to Azerbaijan and visit, and then have a return visit by President Aliyev to Turkmenistan. I think those two visits in a very short amount of time showed that there's a lot of cooperation going on at this moment. When you're talking about energy connectivity, we talk about pipelines in terms of these great grand infrastructure projects, but really all you would need for the Caspian is an interconnector, essentially, between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan. I think if you could get those two countries to address the issues needed to address that, deal with the littoral neighbors, which is much easier said than done, but it doesn't require necessarily something on the scale of what they're dealing with right now with, say, TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. I think that is a much more technically complicated project than just getting across the Caspian to Azerbaijan would be. And the fact, as you pointed out, they've had great cooperation with Uzbekistan. They now have free trade going with that neighbor. I think Turkmenistan is in a place right now, but there's a lot of potential, and there's a lot that could happen.
And this is a country that Turkey has very strong relationships
Absolutely.
with. Very, very strong relationships with. Well,
Kiran, can I just inject one or two sentences? Because Brian pointed to a very important topic. But let me assure you that we have been seeking interconnector, I'm talking about natural gas, between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan at least for the last 15 years. Turkmenistan is sending its natural gas to us via Iran, but our main preference is to receive it from Azerbaijan. It's not a technical challenge at all. There needs to be a kind of political will to finalize it. But I think in the last few years, there have been good progress on having this interconnector between Turkmenistan and Azerbaijan, and then, of course, to Turkey, and then to Europe. So there could be a further progress on that issue, which is also of importance for Turkey. So let's see what will transpire. There might be positive news coming in the near future. Thank you.
Well, with that, I'd like to make sure that there's a little bit of time for the audience to also ask a few questions. So if anyone has something. Oh, let's see. Plenty of options. Well, I feel a little obligated. My boss is raising her hand, so if you'd like to introduce yourself. I know you already have before.
I will pass that introduction, but I have a question for Sobir and whoever may want to take it. We talk about Russian influence, but we never touch base on China. Maybe if you can take a few moments, to talk about, especially maybe Sobir, from business relationship Central Asian countries have with China and the growing Chinese influence as well on certain countries. Thank you.
Sobir?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are a lot to say about growing China influence in Central Asia. The China is definitely a very important partner for Central Asia, and that provides a vital source of development assistance, investments. Now it's measured in billions. I think it's one of its top destination for trade and FDI for Central Asia. And, the China has this framework projects of kind of land connectivity. They need to kind of diversify the trade routes from kind of maritime corridor to the land corridor. And that I think it serves Central Asia very well as we're talking about diversification, connectivity agenda. The One Belt, One Road initiative, now the BRI initiative, we call it, is definitely critical for Central Asia, diversification, connectivity. Plus, with that comes not just kind of infrastructure investments, but the whole economic corridor development. The concept that they're building the kind of logistical hubs, trade routes, infrastructure investments, very critical into the roads, energy. With the green economy transition, China appears to be the most affordable source of green investments, technologies, which are quite expensive to afford, but now they're transforming the Central Asia as we speak in a very positive ways. There is obviously what Central Asia needs to kind of be very mindful is that how to allow Chinese influence not to overtake the kind of the future risks of sovereignty and the territorial integrity, because some countries like Tajikistan, Kyrgyz Republic faces the situation where China kind of controls more than 90% of mining and other critical industries that key to national security of the states. I think it's very important that there is a proper kind of oversight and the good standards set by the governments in these areas. Also, the level of debt to China is growing significantly, so it needs to be managed. And because Kyrgyzstan, especially, particularly a country which has a very high level of foreign debt to GDP, and it's kind of has certain implications. And there have been cases where they lend for equity swaps and debt for equity swaps. So they need to be very mindful of these risks. But I think overall, the China is very key development partner for Central Asia, and especially now with the weakening of Russia, China is not only trade economic partner, they also supply security, military assistance to Central Asian states. But with all this in mind, there are clearly some sensitivities and risks for Central Asia in terms of kind of monopolizing the sphere, but they're trying to find the proper way to balance multi-vector interests between China, Europe, Russia. So far, it's not easy, but when you have a China next door, you have to be friends with them, and that's how they're trying to be good friends. Well, be mindful of potential risks, I would say.
Yeah, so it seems to me that Turkey and China are aligned in some areas where they have similar goals, and that they would both benefit significantly from increased infrastructure and transport connectivity. But at the same time, Turkish companies and Chinese companies also tend to compete in many of the same areas, whether that is energy projects, where you have a lot of Turkish and Chinese companies in those areas, in the actual construction of the infrastructure, in logistics. So how are you seeing cooperation or competition between Turkish and Chinese companies in the region?
Definitely, there is a competition. There is kind of this rhetoric of competing priorities. But I think the best way to address this concern is actually to promote a more kind of regional framework, multilateral engagement through the developing institutions, and set this as a kind of common framework for the open tendering process where the best would win this tender. And because in essence, both China and Turkey are part of the Asian Development Bank, the part of economic cooperation. Not sure about that one. But there's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank from China. There is World Bank, all these programs. There is EU Gateway Fund. That regional framework provides an umbrella where both Chinese and Turkish companies could participate in open tenders and on a win-win basis. And they would apply to the standards set by the set international organization and development bank to develop specific projects. But the Central Asia should get the best out of it. Then I think there is a great room for partnership among both Turkish and Chinese companies. They both bring their unique values and competences, technical know-how, local presence. Like Turkey can bring the local presence, China could bring investments and the kind of hard infrastructure, and that could help succeed and develop win-win solution for Central Asian economic development.
Great. I saw a question from the lady in the third row right here.
GMF, former Foreign Minister of Georgia. We've talked about the traditional sectors of economy that Central Asia have been known for quite a while when it comes to the interest, to the challenges, opportunities at the same time. I want to expand a little bit more on IT and digital field, which is significantly growing, and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are leading on that quite a bit. How much for Turkey is this area of engagement, not only of subject of interest, but then what is the level of engagement and perhaps the projection of growth of that in this field? And in connection to that, climate is definitely a big issue, water scarcity, but beyond that as well. We spoke briefly about the renewables. China is already present in the market, but how much do you see the role of Turkey could be there as well to expand and to do more to help those countries to overcome the challenges that they have, and with that, increase their potential in IT technologies and especially in artificial intelligence-related fields that they target quite a bit now?
Another great question for Sobir.
Yeah, very quickly, I don't want to dominate the field. We had actually a working group on e-commerce under Business 5+1 platform, and we had a fascinating market assessment and a common business agenda from Central Asia on e-commerce. You rightly mentioned that e-commerce, IT, AI now booming in Central Asia, and they're critical to bypass connectivity the challenges for Central Asia, because that helps to connect first with the world in a highly complex geographically region. I would say that there is clearly a great developments and growth in e-commerce in Central Asia, and Turkey could be part of this effort, and they actually being part of this effort. There is a process going on as we speak on harmonization of e-commerce regulations across whole Central Asia. There is a really growth of e-commerce transactions in Central Asia, and that said, that there is a growing, developing local IT, e-commerce, digital trade market in Central Asia that helps any partner, be it Turkey, United States, China, Russia, to join not just the kind of approach, not just one country in the region, but the whole region, company in the whole region, with a growing operations. Turkey has clearly a competitive advantage in developing the IT industry, e-commerce and digital trade, hopefully also AI. But now AI is a big topic as well, not just here, but also in Central Asia. There's AI strategy being developed recently in Kazakhstan, I believe. There's a digital development ministry there working very clearly, and in all our countries. Tajikistan AI is setting, President Rahmon suggested kind of AI data centers and innovation hubs being established in Tajikistan, but using a cheap hydropower for the data centers. And so the huge potential here and there, and one of the roadblocks at the moment is developing the kind of a basic IT infrastructure, connectivity, broadband, internet connection is good in big cities, not good in remote regions. And you can imagine like Kazakhstan is half of Europe, and then you have a good connection in Almaty, Astana, maybe not so good in the region, same in other parts of the Central Asia. I think Turkey can probably share the experience and invest more significantly in kind of IT connectivity that would help to boost trade, e-commerce, but there's also something to do, there's good agenda in harmonization of e-commerce and trade procedures. And it also all comes to the question on cross-Caspian corridor potential. We spoke about infrastructure, but also a trade, soft infrastructure agenda, which needs to be further evolved and developed in terms of harmonization of trade and customs policies and procedures. You have Eurasian Economic Union, you have WTO, you have different kind of trade arrangements. They need to be harmonized for the connectivity agenda to work, be it digital trade or whatever, infrastructure.
And I think just to add on to your question, just as some of the markets that Turkey targets are in Central Asia, Turkey is one of the first places that Central Asian countries target for their markets, particularly in technology and e-commerce. Yeah. One of the big pieces of news that we got of last year, for example, was when a Kazakh company, Kaspi, bought the Turkish e-commerce giant Hepsiburada. Yeah. And we're seeing a lot of movement in that area as well. I think we have time for one very, very brief question, and then we'll have to wrap it up. We have the gentleman in the front right here. If you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you for your comments, and good morning. I'm Steve Powell. 26 years ago, I started an investment bank in New York City called Sino Powell Capital. We did a lot of business with China. That has changed. We've also done work in Russia. That has changed. Recently, we started the Eurasia Fund to invest in your region, not just Central Asia, but also in Eastern Europe. I spent a lot of time in the region. I just got back last month from Turkey, from Kazakhstan, Bulgaria, and Georgia. My question, there are really two parts to the same question. One, how do you juggle your relationship with China, who's your neighbor, and who you seem to be much more friendly with than the United States is, and your relationship with the United States? And the other part of that same question is, how do you help businesses from the United States deal in that region, knowing that you have better connections with China than we do in the United States? Thank you.
I think Sobir's already spoken a bit to the China's relationship with the countries already. So maybe we can focus a little bit on how American businesses can deal with Russian and Chinese presence in the region. And Brianne, if you want to toss something in here as well,
I was
obviously.
actually
you've
going to
got-
defer to the ambassador on this one.
Well, he certainly knows a thing or two.
Okay. I think this is a very relevant question for both state actors and commercial stakeholders. But let me emphasize one particular point. When we started developing the middle corridor for connectivity back in 2010, much before China did, because China announced BRI in 2013, we did not design it as a sub-cluster of Belt and Road Initiative. The idea was to start this activity from Central Asia to Turkey to Europe. And I remember, for instance, having consultations with my Japanese counterparts, with the Nordic and Scandinavian countries, also with the EU, trying to kind of promote this idea of connecting this region to Europe via Turkey. That was important. We never thought of, kind of cooperating with China then, but there are some hard realities. I think there is a channel now between the Middle Corridor authorities and their Chinese counterparts. If there is a kind of mutually agreed point or a common denominator that would kind of reinforce the Middle Corridor, we would more than welcome it. But that was not the original idea. And that's important. Secondly, I think by investing particularly in infrastructure projects in different domains, I'm not talking about only transportation logistics, as I have already said. We are talking about here energy lines of communication, electricity lines of communication. Remember that now, that there was agreement between Azerbaijan, Romania, a kind of cable passing underneath the Black Sea, going to Central Asia, including Romania, Bulgaria, supported by the EU. That's the type of projects we need. And also, of course, for instance, we can also explore cooperation in hydrogen production, green gas, hydrogen combined with natural gas, clean and renewable energies, solar and wind. I mean, there are opportunities for establishing joint ventures. It could be like Europe, the United States, Turkey, and the regional partners, which would also localize these projects, look to more appealing, and that could be a counterbalance to other big powers, including China. We have to think about this in such terms. This is important, and as I have already mentioned, I think we need more institutional ties, and I think this was one of the main themes you raised in your article, Kira, right? The need for institutionalization of these ties, and that requires, of course, more economic, commercial, business activities, and more consultations and cooperation to explore new means of widening the scope of cooperation and increasing the prospects of further integration of these countries to Europe. This is important. And I think this is what they also are seeking for. I mean, just remember the recent C5+1 summit in Washington, D.C., for instance. Increasing visits by the EU authorities to the South Caucasus and Central Asia. Remember the Samarkand summit held in April 2025. I mean, these are important developments, and this should continue. They cannot be a one-shot affair. I mean, we need a kind of, maybe an informal kind of institutional framework, including the US, Europe, Turkey, and our Central Asian partners. This is important, and we should think about this in such a holistic term. That's what I would say, to counterbalance the spoiling influences in that region. Thank you.
Just
Please. All right. Very quick, as we're running out of time.
we have a joint statement of intent on economic cooperation from the recent C5+1 summit. That's to the question from the gentleman. On the commercial environment, there is a line 7. Support open, transparent, stable, fair market that create an enabling environment for commercial activity. I think that's the best that U.S. can do in the region to encourage the level playing field. For all investors to operate in the same way and abiding to the best international standards. It's easy to say, it's hard to do, but it's the only way that U.S. can compete fairly in a complex, very complex environment in Central Asia with China and Russia. Thank you.
All right. And with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us today. This has been really lovely getting to know and hear from all three of our wonderful panelists. There's a lot more that can be done. There's a lot more that can be learned. I encourage you all to read not only my report, but a lot of the other important and recent work that the Atlantic Council has been publishing on our partners working in the region, as well as the internal and domestic politics that happens in Central Asia. And please, thank you very much for joining us.